Okay, we have ourselves our first component. So why don't we talk about it in a little bit more detail? Like I said, import and export we're going to cover later on as we're creating much more of our own components. React render method, we're just going to use it once we have our JavaScript entry, so we don't care about this either. However, we will going to be focusing on our first component, which is, by the way, the stateless functional component. There's two types of components that we're going to be in JavaScript. And there's going to be some differences. And I'm sorry, I just said JavaScript in React. There's going to be two components. One is going to be the stateless functional component, which you're seeing right now, which is at the end of the day created with a function. And the other one we're going to create with classes. So the names differ. They also call this dumb components, and those are smart components because we're going to be setting up something like state on the other components. But again, we haven't talked about it. So for now, I would just encourage you to focus on the fact that this is going to be the stateless functional component, or you can just refer to it as a functional component anyway. All right. So that would be the naming of our component. So what is next? Well, within the component, we already met this weird dude or gal called JSX. And what would be the rules about the JSX? Well, let's start with the most basic one, and that would be the simple fact that we do need to return something. That could be even an empty tag. However, it needs to be something in there. So let's say if I'm going to save it, everything is going to be working fine. However, the moment I'm going to do this, and I'm just going to say, well, yeah, there's going to be return, but then my dev server is going to say, okay, I think you made a mistake because you're not allowed to do that. So always, you need to return something, even though this is just going to be an empty element or anything like that. And that would be the first thing. Next, why don't we talk about what in the world is JSX? And JSX is a syntax used in React because it allows us to write our code in a clear fashion. We technically don't need JSX because at the end of the day, JSX is compiled to JavaScript function calls using Babel. And as a side note, this is why we need Babel as our dependency. Don't believe me? Well, why don't we test it out? So let's say we have our functional component that is working really well. We have our heading 3. And why don't we do this? Why don't we add another div? Just to show you that you're obviously not limited to just having one element over here. I can just say div here, and I'm going to say heading 1. And then within the heading 1, I'm just going to say hello world. Again, the most important thing that you would need to remember first is the fact that you need to return something, at least something. All right. And let's rewrite this component. So first of all, let me comment this out because we cannot have the two components with the same name. So in this case, we're going to say, okay, so again, there's going to be a functional component. We know that we're going to be rewriting the function. Again, I'm going to call this greeting just because I didn't want to rename this. We're not going to be passing anything here at the moment. And then in this case, we're not going to be returning the JSX. Why don't we take a look at what happens behind the scenes? So what is the scenario is that even though we're writing the JSX, this is just to help us to have the familiar syntax. Behind the scenes, what's happening is that this is being compiled down to a function call. So in our case, we're going to say React. Now the name is going to be create element. That would be the function. And then this function or this method is going to take 3 arguments. We have the element, we have the props object, and since we have it covered props, and since we're not going to use this, I'm not going to bother with this. Later on, obviously, once we cover the procs, you can come back and you can fully understand it. But trust me, at this time and moment, you really don't need this. And then we have the children. Now, if we're thinking about it, so element would be the element that we would like to render, and then the children is going to be in our taste this text. So why don't we rewrite this? So I'm going to say over here, and I'm going to skip this heading 1. I'm just going to go with div, and I'm going to show you actually in a second why. But so we have the div. Okay, so then we have the props object. As a side note, as you're working in the React, what's going to happen is that with HTML, you need to put the HTML elements in the quotation marks. However, as you're working with your own components, you don't need to put it in the quotation marks, as well as this is the reasoning why you're adding this capital letter for the React to distinguish of which one is the HTML element and which is the component that you're creating. And here we can pass either this would be our component or let's say the element. So in this case, we're saying this is the HTML element. Keep in mind though, we're not passing here the quotation marks. So this is normal syntax like we would write. So it's not like we are working with template literals in JavaScript. This is the JSX syntax. However, within this create element, or let's say you're going to be working with render or something like that, you need to remember that if this is an HTML element, you do need to have the quotation marks. And then we have the props object, which for now we're just going to leave it empty. And then we have the children. Now, in our case, let me write hello world, and let's see what's going to happen. And yeah, I think I'm having correctly everything. So I have my function, and obviously this is my functional component. And then I'm using the create element to generate the same thing that I had before, not apart from obviously heading one. What would be the downsides of this? Because at the moment you would be like, well, you know what? This syntax is really confusing. Why replacing some HTML in JavaScript and then struggling with this? I think I'm just gonna work with JavaScript because I'm familiar. Well, here's the kicker. If, and in a lot of cases, that's not gonna be if. That's gonna be the case where you will gonna be adding more elements here. The more you're nesting here, the more it's gonna give you a headache. Because if I would want to nest here the heading one, again, I would need to do the same thing. I would need to get this React create element, and then again pass it React create the element. Then what I'm creating, whether that's going to be heading one, and then props, objects, and children. And you can see how you can get down to the rabbit hole really, really fast. So that's the reason why instead we use JSX. And if you're looking at it, you have to admit this is easier to understand. I know it might be a little bit confusing in the beginning, but after all, what you're doing is you will going to be having your returns, and then within the returns, you'll be working with JSX. In the next video, I would like to cover more about JSX because even though it is a lot like HTML, meaning it has a lot of similar features like attributes and stuff like that, there are some quirks about it, some specific things of how we can work with JSX. Before we maybe go, I would like to comment this guy out because this is just, again, for showing. We're not going to be using it throughout the course. I just wanted to let you know why we are working with JSX and what is the actual reasoning for it. And of course, I obviously uncommented my comments. So let me save it. And now everything is working correctly with a hello world.